Namaskar. I welcome all my respected and beloved poets and friends present in today's session of group discussion with Charles Bernstein. I am much honored to have Charles Bernstein in today's session, organized by Ekhon Bangla Kobitar Kagoj. On behalf of the magazine, I welcome you, Charles.
Well, it's fantastic to be here, and Runa had said to me, how could we do something a little bit different with this recording? And so I said, well, let's bring together some of your fellow poets and have a group discussion. That would be fun for me. So I'm glad that we've managed to do that. And then yesterday we read in a bilingual reading. So I'm here in my house in Brooklyn, and I know you folks are in India, in different places probably. Let me start by asking you, Runa, a question.
Charles Bernstein, I will just introduce. Charles Bernstein is already an internationally known poet, theorist, critic, and a leading voice in American poetry, and doesn't require any introduction, but still, as a part of the session, I will briefly introduce him. With several other awards, he is the recipient of 2019 Bollinger Prize for American Literature, the premier American Poetry Prize for lifetime achievement. For his poetry book, Near Miss, he was Donald T. Reagan Professor of English and Comparative Literature, University of Pennsylvania. In 2006, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He is the co-founder and co-editor of Pen Sound and the Electronic Poetry Center. Bernstein is much known as language poet in India, who edited Language Journal with Bruce Andrews from 1978 to 80. But an innovative poet like Charles, whose core idea is to explore the infinite possibilities of poetry, always goes beyond the boundaries of language, with his various inventions to open up the expanded field of language. And his journey resulted in almost 100 books, which he authored or edited. I'll just name few of his books, recent poetry books: Topsy-Turvy, Near Miss, Recalculating, All the Whiskey in Heaven, selected poems. And I would also like to add a few books on poetics, like Attack of the Difficult Poems, Issues and Inventions, and Pitch of Poetry, which includes the pathological imagination, fantasy in 140 feet that really provokes and mesmerized me to explore more on Bernstein. My first interaction with Charles was during my translation project, Bridgeable Lines, an anthology of borderless poetry, which I co-edited and translated. The project includes 12 American poets, including Charles, Mamie Barsenbragi, Elizabeth Willis, Peter Gidgey, Aileen Miles, etc. I would say Charles' answer to my interview taken during this project made me speechless. But I did not know that something more is yet to come. So I was just blown away when I encountered his new poetics, which he coined as cataclysm. My earlier friend, my editor friends here, I think already listening this ism from me to my translations for their magazine. And this is, I would say, a new leftist way to gain freedom from the norm, freedom from authority. It's so much in resonance with my favorite poetics of Parin Bhushan that I fell in love with Bernstein's poetry. Barin was the key poet of the Kaurav literary movement that started in 1969, and he was the introducer of the expansive consciousness theory that resulted to start a new genre, and he named as Natun Kavita, new poetry. That I felt that a strong coherence between Barin's expansive consciousness theory and the concept of conscious imagination of Bernstein's metaphoricalism. The very idea of Barin's poetics of against the passive consumerism of reader, that the poem is activated um, or charged, like, through the energy of the collision of imaginary world between reader and poet, which is redistributed to form a new pattern, a new resonance. So this is where Bernstein's theory of exchange economy coheres, which creates a model of democratic social space to aim for the social practice, where the constituted reality of the poet is reconstituted by the reader through exchange, through critical reading. This impact of their coherence steers me to explore more on Bernstein work, and then that open up multiple possibilities of my thoughts that fuels the fires of the reader's soul in me, and that to strike, to resist, to attack. So I am really honored to have such experience with the Bernstein's work. I think I must stop here to transfer my microphone to our guest speaker, Charles Bernstein. Charles, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to just start off by asking you a little bit more of what you said in your introduction about your first experiences with American poetry and poetry in English. So the English and the American come together. Obviously, there's English in India as well, but American English is quite different and a different context. And it's been my feeling that in India, there's, of course, because of the English British influence, to say the least, there's perhaps a little less engagement with American poetry, at least the American poetry that I'm interested in India. And in fact, it probably still remains distant. Yet you have such a warm and incredibly interactive feeling about it. So talk to me a little bit about your relation to American poetry, and maybe a little bit about the translation that you've done with the different American poets that you've worked with. What in particular has struck you about the differences in the translation work that you've done, or transcreation work that you've done?
Well, I don't know much about the conventional American poetry of the present day. I know Dickinson, Poe, or Pound, like Emerson or Wittgenstein, etc. But I am lucky enough that I interacted directly with those poets who are aversive to conventional approach to reconvey, to acknowledge the world as is, to open the path to world could be, as you said in your topsy-turvy. I could easily feel what the official verse culture means, as you mentioned frequently, because this culture is same anywhere in the world. but we want to go anywhere out of the world. About translation, what I would say, when a poem is translated from its source language to the target language, both languages move to a third place to create a new poem. That is where I prefer to call it transcreation, not the translation. There is always the controversy between the loyalty and its liberty. Uh, does the loyalty to the source language mean the lexical translation to create a word for word meaning? Does the loyalty means the literal imitation of the source language? Uh, Metaphrase or paraphrase means it's a static or dynamic equivalence. Which one can open the veil of the poetic beauty, what you call? So through our long session of conversation with you during my translation of your work, I could realize that the cultural divergence between India and America needs to be incorporated. The social context of America is so different than from my surrounding that I faces the biggest challenge like that African American dialect, colloquial, their cultural specific references are something that cannot be articulated in Bengali space. So wrong and right translation will go side by side. Mm, and I received that comfort from you, from your speech of poetry, where you are saying, I will just read, mm, if we ever arrive at the correct translation, then we have entered a void, a dead space. Otherwise, we are in process with one translation, like one possibility, provoking another. So, and you are asking my experience of translation work with each of the American poets. It's very different, but common in one place that everyone has broadened my views, my thoughts, that turning my attention to different directions. Like I would like to mention Mamie Barsenberg, the translation from her work, Hello the Roses, that though her uses of nature and science in poetry is very much in resonance with my poetry, but I was so amazed by her spectacles, her feelings, her reflections, her expressions. Then I could I would say that Elizabeth Will, it's like translation from her book Human Abstract, that sparks me to think what the figuration means relative to figure of speech. How we might think of the figure where this human is figural, but abstract is always non-figural in terms of the visual composition. So again, that Peter Giese translation I have done on his book Archaeophonics. So I experienced to visualize what the lyrics of reality means. That how our tradition, our culture, politics, our language, our love and loss that shape the soundtrack of the real. Finally, I would like to see my personal experience when I started translating your fantasy, patagogical imagination. I learned how to imagine a growing imaginary through language. what the expanded field of language means. Your sincere responses to all my queries during my work always open up multiple possibilities of my thoughts. Even your fun, your sarcasm sometimes triggers me to write visionary criticism instead of conventional reviews. That's all. I think our our firing squad is ready to shoot you, Charles. So
Okay, well, let me go back to the gallery view and see we have our fellow poets across the languages of Bengali and English. So how do you want to proceed? Maybe each person I can talk to a little bit.
I would like to request Pranab to start our discussion. He is our beloved Paharu, a mountain man, the adventurous mountaineer, not only the guide of our trekking with poetry events, but also the first person to respond to our newly published books. He is the recipient of national and international photographic awards. With his photographs and my poetry, we recently published our collaboration work 50 magical moments with a poet. Pronab, please start.
Yeah, it's a great privilege for me to speak with Mr. Charles Bernstein. Today, we all gathered here to express our feeling and realization on Charles' poetic journey. Nevertheless, here, everybody was very closely associated with late poet Barin Ghoshal, the new pathfinder of Bengali new poetry movement through Kaushik literary magazine. Recently, while reading Charles' poetry, Runa correctly said there is a coherent, sparking relations of Barin Notun Kobita, that is new poetry, and Oti Chetona, expensive consciousness, with Charles' Poetic. I had the very first opportunity to know about Charles in 2007 in an interview by Arjunil Mukherjee. Recently, I was mesmerized to read The Boundary True, an international journal of literature and culture, special issue on Charles, which was kindly sent to me by Runa. It is a fascinating reading of very different voice of Charles. Yesterday, the bilingual poetry reading was also wonderful. I must say, especially Charles' poetry strike. Now, Charles, in your long, illustrious, creative career with Susan B., from very beginning, you both visited numerous museums and galleries, as well as exhibition, to see various photographs, paintings, sculpture. While reading your poetry, I found a different kind of possibilities in your different ways. Charles, I want to know from you how you incorporated all those things in your poetry.
Well, I'm very grateful for your comments, and it's very heartening to hear what you said, because you mentioned Arjanil Mukherjee, who's now lives in Ohio,
Yeah,
as an engineer and scientist.
right.
He asked me at that time. I had just had two young children, and I was having a new job, and so I was very just trying to keep my head above the water. But he wanted me to be more involved with the magazine Karub and with the Bengali poets that he was in touch with, and I really just I didn't do it. I didn't have the time, and I regretted it. But it was just a limitation, and but I always had it in the back of my mind, and so I was so pleased with through Runa now to come back to this and to make up for that lapse of some years ago. Of course, it's a many different cultures that I can interact with and I'm interested in. So it does lead to your question. You mentioned Pound's name came up in Runa's comment. So he set a kind of way of understanding how you can incorporate multiple different cultural and aesthetic modes into a poem, and Eliot as well. But this was for reasons that are well known, both very inspiring, but also very limited, because there's the danger of the panopticon, the idea that here I am sitting in my office. I never use this Zoom view because I don't like, the feeling of the poet behind all their books. I have read a lot of books, but I'm a seeker. I don't know about the different things that I'm reading about. I'm engaged with them. I'm learning about them. I don't want to be on top of them. So for me, the challenge in respect to your question, it is true that Susan and I, traveled the world looking at paintings and then listening to music and, kind of broad world and European culture. So I know a lot about individual works of art and historical things. So what does that do? I don't have an overview. I don't want to provide an overview. What I want to provide is the experience of moving through the process of seeing these things and how they contingently relate to one another. And the contingent is important, that you put one thing next to another as on a walk. You see one thing and then another in the flow of consciousness, the flow of perception, the flow of reading, or like collage. But you're not saying that there's some pattern underneath it that brings the things together. Rather, the patterning comes from the juxtaposition, the contingency, the awareness of putting one thing after another, and then perhaps making echoes, motifs, rhythms of it, but that allow for an experience which is immanent, not controlling. So it's the encounter with the world, and also the world understood as all of these different cultural experiences, cultural artifacts, artworks, and feeling open as a writer to incorporate that material without necessarily even knowing what I'm doing, and also emphasizing that I don't know what I'm doing. So for me, it's the epistemology, you could say, and
right.
I talked about that in my letters with my, she called it sarcasm, which is quite right. Sarcasm is different than irony, is that even if she asks me a question that might be simple, what do you mean by? I will typically say, I don't exactly know. I mean, it could be this, it could be that, because the words and the juxtapositions are there because they strike me then I don't know what they mean. I don't control them. And if I actually knew exactly what something meant, I wouldn't use it. It would seem boring to me. So it's a kind of it's an experience that I want to create of openness, of movement, of process, but not indefinite, as vivid as possible, as irrefutable as possible, as an experience is. So the other side of that response to the controlling modernism is a complete absence of control. And I'm not interested in an absence of control. I'm interested in creating an experience in an artwork which is as intense as any of the great artworks that I saw in the museums of Europe when I was young, or the great books that I've read over the years. I want to be part of that world of creating intense art experiences. And then, so much has to do with, the choices that I make, my own historical experience, my own limitations, my own body and perceptions, and my cultural and historical experiences through my parents and grandparents. Growing up in New York is a very important part, because a lot of what I say has to do with growing up in Manhattan, spent all my life there, and the experience of living in a city like that and having the poems reflect that urban landscape such as New York, since after all, American poetry traditionally has been based on people, in a rural experience or a countryside experience, not Poe, certainly, that Runa mentioned, but so, having, the time, you say, born in 1950, a lot of my work is still very rooted in the 50s and the 60s, and very mediated by the Cold War here in the United States and the rise of the US state in relation to its disturbing and violent desire to control other parts of the world, and the legacies of civil rights and women's rights issues here in the United States when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. So all of that is part of the background, which at various points I kind of zoom in on and give little swatches of. So does that somewhat respond to your question?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So nice to hear from you. So I think we can talk about this also later on. So Runa, you can ask any other friends to fire.
I request now Probhat Mukherjee, our senior most poet, essayist and translator, to start conversation. I will just introduce. He is a senior most poet, essayist and translator. His essays explore the psychological and social effects of uprooted refugees during the partition of British India at the time of independence. How their struggles, their constant fights to survive against all odds, the crisis in Indian social space due to that displaced millions of people along the religious borderline, shaped the poetic expressions in Bengali language. He also translated various short stories of the Canadian Nobel laureate Alice Munro. So, Probhat, you please start your question.
Okay, thank you, Charles and Runa. Now, I've got two sets of questions. Being a student of history,
please.
Language poetry movement means critical intelligence. Okay, inventing new ways, new thinking, new use of words, newer things. So that required a level of critical intelligence. Okay. Now it is just innovative use of words. First thing. The second thing is thematization and this one, what you call meaningfulness. You have used several words with different connotations. Like I can read that one quotations I have got, that not that I mean to startle, just unsettle the settlers. This type of using of words, the settlers pitch their tents into foreign ground. All ground is foreign. So the use of words in different connotations, this we have experienced in your writings. So new set of things. And the second part of my question is the language poetry, poets, they identified themselves with the social enterprise. Now, in the 1980s, we have seen welfare statism. 1990, we have experienced end of history. Now, yesterday, I have heard your COVIDity. It impressed me very much. Now, COVIDity, it's a failure of the system of health system in India as well as in US. Now, medical insurance. During the 1980s, we have experienced insurance, health insurance as a major concern. Now, medical insurance, now it is become a market economy aspect. Okay, now even job for the millions, we have switched over from one bipolarity to unipolarity. All these things, how you see the fate of language poetry, how language poetry is going to contribute. End of history for whom?
I prefer to take that as a commentary rather than as something I can directly answer, because for me the scale is so big, and yet everything you say are things that are immensely intimate to me. They're the things I think about every day. So I think the part of what I'm interested in is writing poetics and talking here and creating poems that resonate with the various concerns that you bring up. So these are kinds of things that are on my mind, and I bring them together in perhaps unexpected ways, unexpected to me, to sort of rethink how those issues work. But I think identifying the set of things that you do is completely accurate. So you have and we could add a few more, and the discussion today so far has really, been good in terms of the kind of my motifs, and I permute them in different ways to allow different things to come out. So for me, I said early on in my work, I have a poem which has the line that poetry is a fertilizer, not a tool. So this, just to be as simple as possible on what I call the politics of poetic form. A lot of the folks that I was close with in poetry and in life in the 1960s and 70s were involved in the struggle against US intervention in Vietnam, the civil rights movement at that time, feminism. But we were not interested in, of course, socialist realism. We weren't interested in poems that had a political or moral message that gave a view as if they were editorials in a newspaper, or even expressed our personal outrage at these outrageous things in a direct way. We were more interested in exploring how language connected up with ideology, consciousness, perception. So all of the issues that we identify politically tend to get reduced in large scale political discourse to phrases or individual nouns, and even socialism or communism, wealth, taxes. These are complicated questions which are often reduced to very simplified memes, really. So one possibility for poetry is to open those things up and to rethink what those nouns are. As Stein says, to kind of stop writing all about nouns, all about descriptions of the world as if the world were some fixed thing that you were describing, but rather to be involved in the poesis. So this was the project that we took on with Language Magazine in the late 70s, and I've been involved with ever since. And I like the term that you use, critical intelligence, or you could also say critical imagination. I think that there's a real push against critical intelligence and critical imagination in US culture, which often wants to be very reductive. There's an intense anti-aesthetic and anti-intellectual environment that is as strong now as it was in the 1950s. And to push against that is to risk being stigmatized as incomprehensible or elite or not or immoral, really, decadent. And it's important, to understand those headwinds when you're speaking about American poetry, because you're working against a very entrenched and conservative mainstream and an increasing obsession that value has to be mass culture value, that the only value is created through market share or YouTube hits, and that's the only thing worth talking about. So to kind of circle back around to your middle point, which I like very much about, I use words with different meanings. Yes, I'm obsessed with that for a number of reasons, but the way words can flip around. So in different contexts, you can use the same word or the same phrase to mean quite different things. And a lot of my work involves a kind of spinning around where I'll start using even a common saying and then turn it around so that it's literalized or has a different resonance. And it's creating this echo or resonance, which is my aesthetic interest. And it often involves reversing, turning things upside down or topsy-turvy, substituting one expected word, substituted for an expected word, something unexpected that might sound like it, so substitution. So that it creates a kind of bounce or musical space of thought, the music of thought inside the language environment that you're immersed in when you're reading, but both immersed and also pushed back by, because you can't always understand it. Almost like in a space flight where you become gravity free. Imagine a poem as being that moment in which you're free of gravity and you're floating around inside the language. I love the line you quoted. I don't remember it exactly, but it's very much at the heart of my thinking. But it's something like all ground is foreign if you get to know it as good as I have. So that itself is a kind of a contradiction, which takes on different senses of ground, foreign, and then familiarity. So for me, foreignness is the most familiar. It's the given. And I also think of that as a politics that goes against, I could call it many different things, but let me just for the moment call it ethno-nationalism, which is to me a very destructive force.
Yeah.
To me, it's destructive to me personally, but in the world that I grew up in and now, very destructive. But of course, there's a balance between respect for communities, groups, and histories, and how that can morph on the right and the left into a kind of ethno-nationalism. So the concept of the foreignness, being foreign even in your own language, is very important to me, and that's exhilarating. In a way, that's aesthetic space. It frees you within the play of that aesthetic space to think in a different way. However, when I return to the world and I go back onto the street, of course, I'm not in free play. I'm constrained by all of the social and political constraints and politics that everybody else is. So I would distinguish the aesthetic space in a poem from the other kinds of political action which are necessary, but which are not poetry. So to me, they work in a dialectical relationship and they're crucial to one another, but you can't reduce one to the other. They're not the same.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does that respond to your question?
Yeah. That the particularly if in the light of your the other poem, that strike.
Mm-hmm.
Strike poem that I heard yesterday.
Yes.
That was also a socio-political issues have come up.
Right. Well, I appreciate you mentioning strike. I'll say a word about it since it's in the other recording. That was a poem. It's in Recalculating, so it must be about 10 years ago. I was exactly in that poem thinking about 1968. I was 18 in 1968, 1969, where we had the student demonstrations. I was arrested in college, as many of us were, for protesting against the war in Vietnam and other related issues, and was involved in many demonstrations. And there were these wonderful posters, really, in a way, inspired by Paris, 1968, which had very poetic sentiments of that aspiration of 1968. And of course, there were strikes, many strikes, such as student strikes. So I wanted to revisit that, but to revisit it with a kind of a range of different modalities, indeed the sarcasm that Runa speaks about, but also direct political statement. So in that poem, as in others like that, poem War Stories is like that. I have individual sentences which are very specific political opinions, which are the ones that I have. And then I kind of keep torquing it or turning it toward kind of personal issues, individual desires, things that move away from any kind of agenda. And it seems to me you get a kind of a spectrum in that, which gives the sensibility in reflection of 1968. And I think only in taking in the darker sides and some of the less specific political statements can you get an understanding of the sweep of what a radical alternative poetics and politics is like, that you have to include these range of different valences within the spectrum. They can't be excluded. So the dark with the light, with everything in between, or the different spectrum of colors, you could say as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Probhat.
Thank you.
Now, Swapan, please, is the editor of Notun Kobita, New Poetry, print magazine from Kolkata. He made his poetic journey with sound power of words to make the resonance with his different kinds of acoustic, aversive to genre of lyrical rhyme, and surrealistic genre of the poetic institution. He authored nearly 20 books. Swapan, please start.
Yes. Hello, Charles.
Hello, good to see you.
In this COVID trying, you're well, I think. You're fine, no?
Fortunately, yes. Fortunately, I have been COVID free.
We all are fortunate in that sense.
Very much so.
I'll go straight to one of your poetry, where that is questionnaire. It's very interesting. You give one directions for each pair of sentences. Circle the letter A or B that best expresses your viewpoint. Exception from each pair. Do not omit any items. Now we have given some options. One, the body and the material things of the world are the key to any knowledge we can possess. B, in that one, it includes knowledge is only possible by means of the mind or psyche. Now, in two, A, my life is largely controlled by luck and chance. B, I can determine the basic course of my life. The juxtapositions. So very interesting. Now it goes on like that. I'm not going deep into it. So when we started thinking something new in Bengali poetry in early 90s, our friend, philosopher and guide, Barin Ghoshal is no more. Barinda is no more. So we started thinking in this way also, that how can we change the established, Bengali poetry thinking, thought process. So we individually came to a decision that we must close the inlet of existing Bengali poetry. We must close imageries, we must close analogy, we must close all sort of rhyming patterns. And at that period of time, Bengali poetry was ruled by surrealism in true sense. So we stopped all those inlets, and we, in the outlet, we started writing in Bengali language by discarding verbs, rhymes, philosophical pronouncement, dramatic patterns, and all that. So interestingly, Barinda and Aryanil Mukherjee, they led to your work to me in those periods. When Aryanil went to America, he sent me over that time in the early 90s. He sent me your work and language poetry and all that. Very interestingly, in language poetry, you did very innovative work in that area. Even in we were talking about translation earlier. You homolinguist translation, translation in dialect and intellect, and homophonic translation, very interesting. So then even in the creative portion, you mentioned and very interesting and adventurous projects like Zara's Hat, Acrostic Chances, Boros Fold-In, all that, very interesting. And that, in one sense, that rearranged the American poetry to me, and I was surprised, and I was rather also, what do I say? No, what do I say? I was also very much, engaged in that process, and enjoyed the entire your all these innovative experiments. So my question is very much two questions actually. Do these experiments, undoubtedly very innovative, led you to a diction of your own, or these were meant for a language engineering in poetry to attack and change the established American English poetry? And the second one is, do you think that the unchaining of prevailing poetic consciousness is necessary for a new space in poetry? That's all for the time being.
Well, thank you very much for that. Once again, I'm not. I'm really not tempted to. I'm interested actually in that sound and the disruption of the communication. Everything in the world that we're in, including these Zoom things, is all about making it seem like there's not technology, not having the buzzes, not explaining how that you need to mute or unmute. That always seems like somehow it's a mistake and you should try to erase it. And I guess my interest has always been the opposite, that I want to foreground all of those aspects and take them in. So I would say about that buzzing that it's a fantastic experience for me to hear your comments. But I'm also aware, as much as you are, maybe not as much, but I'm trying, of the enormous asymmetry. It's a very different situation for my experience and my relation to English to the poetry and the experience you have in West Bengal and India. And I'm not saying that we're sharing the same experiences and we can do the same thing. I'm interested in always being aware of that buzz and that static. We don't have a clear channel. There is no clear channel. But if you can emphasize that sounding the medium, the buzzing and the static, then at least you can you can see your point of contact with it. So what I've done just now is to mute you because that's making the sound, and I'm really interested in that because I have the power to mute. And I think this is really what a lot of poetry is about. You have a whole lot of signals out there, like 100 of them, and you mute every single one. And you find the one that you like and you keep that one, but everything else you're kind of clicking mute, mute, mute. We spend most of our time muting everybody else, and so we can listen. So maybe unmuting is a good thing that we should, could be my poetics. You start with a poem questionnaire. I had put that literally in a drawer, not as a metaphor. I wrote it in my mid-20s. The questionnaire poem, which were these, life is the result of chance and luck, or I absolutely control my fate. Pick A or B. And I found it years later, and I thought, oh, this is kind of okay. So I put it in a book, and actually, it's taken a little bit of a life of its own. But I didn't really take it seriously when I first wrote it. But it does speak to the double bind aspect that you have to choose politics or poetry, for example. And your questions to me, and sometimes you do have to choose. By the way, I'm not saying you don't have to choose. We have to make choices, often the wrong ones, every day. We can't refuse to choose. But in poetry, you can, in a way, create a suspension. So your comments to me are also these kinds of, which one is it? Are to experiments, are they meant to contest the dominance of a certain kind of inauthentic lyric voice, which is claimed as authentic and used as the marker for what real poetry is? Or do they open up a space for new poetic thinking? And the answer is both. But it's a sharp question, because it is true that I am often very ornery and oppositional, both in my poetics and in my poems. So often I am contesting, and people will say, in a sense, what I would call bad postmodernism, or what Marx would call the young Hegelians. I'm not just about debunking. Debunking is not an end in itself. Debunking doesn't interest me, but sometimes you have to be negative. So I'm more interested, let's say, in an Adorno-like negative dialectics, because the end of debunking is just more debunking. So yes, the crucial task is to create a new poetic space, new poetic language, new, not in the sense of improved, new being necessary to keep up with and probably just be a little bit behind the present, not in advance of the present, not avant-garde, but not locked in to modes and positions that are no longer relevant, and that constantly changing, constantly shifting. I would say the same about the second question, which also plays on a distinction between, in a sense, necessity and freedom, and consequence. And I think one has to be wary of all those things. And in a sense, in a poem, I sometimes think it's like an old, like an early video game, or where you're bouncing from one thing to another. You go in one direction and you get smacked and you get hit, and you come into another. So every decision you make, you could see a poem as, in at least the poems that I'm interested in, as constantly creating obstacles or problems based on the choice that you made, so that something, so slapstick in a way, something just jumps up at you and pushes you in the other direction, and sort of negotiating those widely swinging kinds of spaces that are, you know, a part of everyday life, a part of the experience of everyday life, but not trying to mute them or erase them. So I hope I've spoken to your question, and I thank you very much for it. And your comment.
Thank you very much, Sapunda. Now I request Umapada. He is an eminent Bengali poet and essayist in our new poetry group. And he authored nearly 15 books of poetry and 4 books of prose. His upcoming book with the English translation of his Bengali poems, where I am also one of the translators. Umapada, please go ahead.
Yes, I am ready.
Please shoot with your question, Umapada.
Oh, I am just seeing you, not mine. However, are you hearing, Mr. respected and dear poet, Sir Charles Bernstein? Are you hearing me?
Yes, I do hear you, and I see you too.
Yes.
I see you in
Yes.
a very nice space with your white sweater, and
Yes. Thank you, respected and dear poet. And also I am adding, sir.
yes, I'm not. You know, I don't have. I'm waiting for the Queen before she dies.
Yes.
To give me that designation. We don't really have that in America. We don't have that, but I would like to get that.
However, just I am now in my own points. As a reader of your few poems, and as well as you are the pioneer and co-founder of the language poetry movement in USA, I humbly intend to raise 3 questions at a time for you.
Okay.
One, first, in the magazine, the word language, in the magazine, the word language, 8 capital letters are attached with 7 equal signs, equal to signs in between them, as I think so. What is the reason behind it? And what is its significance?
Okay, let me do one at a time, because otherwise I'll get lost. So, you know, it's I have a very unexciting answer to this question. We went through many names, and funny names and serious names, Bruce Andrews and I, in coming up with this title, and we decided language was a good title, and I could explain to you why. But I mean, essentially, people would say at the time, rightly, but all poetry is involved with language and verbal language, and but we still wanted to emphasize what we called at the time the language centeredness of poetry, that it was more involved with the aesthetics of the verbal creation than depicting something outside of that. So, and you know, also connecting to Wittgenstein and others. So language as medium for poetry, for grounding verbal language and verbal language play. But there was another magazine called Language that was out there, and it was the Journal of the Linguistics Association of America. And so we didn't want to have the exact same name. Also, wonderful American poet Jack Spicer had he had a poem named Language based on that journal. So we thought, what can we do to sort of differentiate, really to make a logo
out from the problem?
And we came up with putting these equal signs in as a visual marker in terms of the way it looks. and then, but of course it is L equals. So you could say with your, the 26 letters of the alphabet or the 30 letters of the alphabet, you can recombine and you can create the universe. Maybe it's that. But of course, like with most poetic decisions of mine, and in this case, Bruce Andrews and me, we're trying to push the word language a little bit more interesting and having the visual. Also, I think even more interesting to me than the meaning of equal signs was the fact that we wanted to incorporate a non-letter element, a standard element within language, because that also expands even what the alphabet is. It isn't just the letters, but also symbols like question marks, periods, punctuation marks, as well as equal signs. So it brings in a kind of visual poetry way, a non-letter symbol. And actually, some places, including the New York Times, the ones that they wanted to mention us, they refused to use the equal signs. It took the emergence of corporations and mass culture figures who use these kinds of symbols in their names for them to change that policy. But when the ones that they did mention us, I wrote them, they said they would not, it was their policy not to include any kind of non-letter symbols, except if you're a big corporation, I guess, and then it became fine. So I like that too, that it was something that somehow was resisted. It wasn't really the proper orthography. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. Interesting, very much. And the second, in a poetry, I am not an atheist. You have written, there is no use kicking a dead rhinoceros or a red one either, for the matter. You are not an atheist, okay, as a result. Or naturally, you are theist. Then you should be existentialist, and you may be the realist or materialist. Are you Marxist?
I refuse to answer that question. It's funny, I was asked that question recently, and I was trying to go back and think about, was I a Marxist? And that may answer your question. Was I ever? And I think the answer is, and it may disappoint some, no. I mean, my joke about that is always, yes, I'm a Marxist. I'm a Groucho Marxist. I'm a Harpo Marxist. I'm a Chico Marxist, the Marx brothers. I am many things. I mean, going back to, there are many things that I'm, I like Lucretius, for example. So I'm a Lucretian. I like Emerson. I'm certainly an Emersonian. So I'm a Marxian in that way, that it's like Poe. I'm a follower of Poe and Marx and Baudelaire and a lot of people in the present. So for me, I'm not, and I know this is my downfall. Many people have criticized it. There's no one thing that I am in that way. I don't have a particular label that I can describe.
Yeah.
However, I will say this in respect to Marxism, really going to go out on a limb. I'm not going to speak about India. I'm going to speak about the United States. The vast, obscene accumulation of wealth on the part of not only 1% of the population, but 1/10 of 1%, taking away those resources from the rest of the people in this country, creating enormous poverty, and this will sound Marxist, taking that money away from the people who create the wealth of the culture, not necessarily production, but the wealth of the culture is all of us here together, is not only obscene, but unspeakably violent and oppressive. And this country has to address that question of the distribution of wealth. I mean, to me, everything I said is, I'm happy to say it, but it seems to me, of course, who is going to disagree with that? But of course, many people disagree with it. But I would say that would be a good statement of one of my many policies. Of course, the question is, how do you achieve that? There is the difficulty. And, yes, I could say also, without question, that over the last 150 years, there have been a lot of very bad ways of addressing that problem. People who agreed with me, but went about addressing that problem in a way that made things worse. As there have been a lot of people who have tried to prevent that distribution of wealth, who have also made things worse. So we got a lot of bad things that have happened for good motivation and for bad motivation. But I'm also interested in the destruction that comes from people acting with good intention, but also creating terrible destruction. So that's why a certain kind of reflective poetics, as I am so interested in, seems to me important to avoid reintroducing totalitarian and authoritarian responses to totalitarian and authoritarian problems.
Okay, I've got my answer. And last but not the least, in the poetry, me and my fellow, you have placed a lot of statements evolved in your mind as an intelligent, prudent, and wise person. I can repeat some of them if you please allow me, then I can utter. One, poetry has no purpose, and that is not its purpose. Two, every poem must have 13 distinct frames, devices, motifs, styles, forms, or concepts. Poetry emasculates prose. Three, the body can't live with it, can't live without it. Four, beauty is the memory of the loss of time. Memory is the reflection of the loss of beauty. In italics, American poetry suffers from its lack of uncreativity. Five, lust. When I am listening to language, it's the field of my consciousness. When we stop making, manufacturing, imposing, since then we have chance to find it. Now, my question is very easy. Poetry, all these are statements. Then the poetry is made of statements. Don't you think that the aesthetics of the poetry has been destroyed in this way? What is your opinion in this regard of aesthetics of poetry as a whole? That's my question.
Thank you very much. And I will answer very simply that yes, the answer to your question is yes. The aesthetics are being destroyed by the statements. And a new aesthetics is born through that creative destruction.
Guha Majumdar, he is an extraordinary poet who negates the conventionality of language with his play of words to profit his new poetry. He authored 8 poetry books so far. Prashanta, please.
Yes.
Your question.
Good evening, Charles.
Good evening.
Good evening, my friends. Good evening, Akhon Bangla. I'm very, very honored to be with Charles and my friends all together. Now, I like to introduce Mrs. And Runa interaction. Charles Bernstein is made known to me by Runa, my friend, the poet, renowned essayist, translator, partially because of my little intellect. However, I have come to believe that Bernstein's writing is serious, engaging, and critical, while also being playful, irreverent, and deeply humorous. Notwithstanding the fact, I should be grateful to both of them for making me stand before a wide window through which new horizons of poetry are opened before me. The same experience I had, though with slight different mode, when Balin Ghoshal is with me. However, tonight, let me come to the point. I would like to recall the words you Bernstein says in an interview with Bradford Penning.
Hmm.
Can you remember Bradford saying, I want, just you have said, I want to engage the materials of the culture, derange them as they have deranged me, sound them out as they sound me out. Now, in the light of such deliverance, may I request my dear poet, most humbly, to put some words before us, stating the meaning and characteristics of materials of the culture as was meant for, process of derangement, and sounding the materials out as they sound him out. Please, Charles.
Well, thank you so much also for that comment. I have to say that my own experience here is I enjoy much more hearing your comments than what I have to say. And what you say doesn't really require really a comment from me, but more just or even an answer, because I don't. You're inside already what I would say. I mean, derange is, I suppose, echoes dérèglement from Rimbaud, derangement of the senses from the French poet Rimbaud. You know, and he also says very famously, we always quote, I is another, and that's another possible source for this poetry, which isn't based on the personal expression of the person writing in their own name. You know, this is something that's much misunderstood with with what you're asking about derangement. In my particular work, my poetry is all about my point of view. It's the most it completely expresses the views and perceptions that I have. So sometimes people say, well, the poem doesn't have a point of view, it doesn't have emotion, it doesn't have a direct voice, but it's even more so than conventional poetry, not less so. It's more expressive, and it's more about my sensibility. But my sensibility exists within a larger world, which constantly comes into it, both punctures it and opens it up. And there's no clear boundary between myself and the world. But that is also my sensibility, and it comes out of who I am as a poet. And so I would just revise the Rimbaud I is another, to say a very simple change, that I is many others. Who I am is also many others. It's not only that in my poetry I say polyvocal, multi-voiced, but also when I'm writing it, I'm hearing, both by being haunted by and being immersed in, many other voices that are contradictory and that are fighting with one another and are in conflict. So this conflict, which goes to the earlier question about statement, is very important to me, that I see language and thought and statements as being involved not in resolution of a single true thought distilled, although there's wonderful poetry written like that, but rather as an exploration of the turmoil of consciousness and the conflict and contradiction within consciousness and language, and coming to terms with and hearing the beauty and the aesthetics within that multiplicity and contradiction. So where some may hear noise or chaos, I hear the sublime and the beautiful, to use the terms of my predecessor, Immanuel Kant. So I don't really answer exactly your question, but some further thoughts on what you bring up.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Prashanta.
Thank you, sir.
Now,
Yes,
Kaushik
yes.
Chakraborty,
I
please.
can hear you.
Thank you.
Kaushik wears many hats: poet, essayist, translator, and novelist, and also our favorite vocalist, a song maker, and a painter. He authored 4 poetry books and recently published a novel. Kaushik, please go ahead with your question.
My deepest regards for all of you present today, and it's been an honor to get the opportunity in talking to Mr. Charles Bernstein. So
Sorry,
my deepest-
Kaushik, you on your camera, you are not visible.
Okay.
Right, it's okay now.
yeah.
Carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. So actually, the moment I got introduced with your poems, that was way back 4 or 5 years back. And since at that time, I didn't have any of your books in hard copy, so I had to rely on the internet. So today I'm going to start my question upon quoting 2 or 3 lines from 2 of your poems that I got from the internet. I decided to recreate that situation. Sorry, Pranab, I have to go to a certain page to quote the lines, so temporarily I'll not be visible. I'm just quoting the lines. One poem is called "Thank You for Saying Thank You," where Mr. Bernstein is writing that this is a totally accessible poem. There is nothing in this poem that is in any way difficult to understand. All the words are simple and to the point. There are no new theories, no ideas to confuse you. This poem has no intellectual pretensions. It is purely emotional. And then there is another poem called Thinking, I Think, where Mr. Bernstein is writing, what are the aesthetic values and why do there appear to be lesser and fewer of them? The baby cries because the baby likes crying. So let me start my question from these 2 lines that since in our discussions till now, Mr. Bernstein already in the very first answer to Pronab's question, he uttered a word that words are not often known to me. And then the issue of muting and unmuting, discovering newer words came out. So it's just as a reader, it's my own curiosity that I think, have you ever thought of this situation where a word that was till the time it was not written in the form of text had the innumerable possibilities of getting interpreted or being written or being uttered, but once we write it down in pen and ink or maybe on computer, so once we write it down, it gets narrowed into a certain perspective what I intend. So have you ever felt that the real poem that you wanted to write, the real feeling that you had before actually writing it down was better being expressed with a sound of silence rather than the sound of words?
It's a wonderful comment. And, I thank you also for the quotes from the 2 poems. The answer to your question is no. Silence is I have a verbal stream going on in my mind all the time, and what I write is closer to my perceptions than than silence would be. But I understand these are very long, important philosophical issues, and I hear what you're saying. I have spent a lot of time thinking about poetry readings and the importance of the reading, the performance, as opposed to the written text. And have a big sound archive of recordings of poets reading. And that partly relates to this idea of sounding and the spoken, and the importance of the performance of the word versus a certain conception just of the written word. And I certainly understand the long history of, which leads to your question, which is that many cultures, in fact, most human culture didn't have writing, and writing is a specific historical development, and in a lot of ways was used to abduct people into a system of thought and into a culture which was not theirs, and so forth, and muted them by making them speak through and in another language. So it goes back to the issue I was talking about, that all language is foreign. And I'm very engaged with that. And I'm also, quite interested and engaged with work that's created in non-written cultures and how that transition takes place. As much as, I grew up in New York City, but in the 20th century, 21st century. Then I would add one other very important feature, which I hadn't mentioned, which is, being Jewish and Jewish culture. I'm not an observant Jew. I'm not religious, but still, I'm ethnically Jewish and go back a long ways as far as imaginable, thousands of years, in a culture which is obsessed with the written word. So it's always it's such an interesting question to ask me about, is the word primary? Because of course the Torah, yes, of course the Torah is primary. But I would say even about the Torah is, the meaning of it only has meaning in interpretation, especially in the midrashic sense, when it is interpreted through spoken commentary and also dialogue like this, discussion. The truth lies in the discussion, not in the actual word. The word is there to provoke discussion and multiplicities of meaning. And so I think poetry can actually operate not as the law, as narrowing down and stipulating the meaning, but as a way of opening up within a culture that has writing some of the same possibilities that we imagine for cultures without writing. So I don't think cultures for writing have to be more limited than cultures without writing. And I have to emphasize also, I don't think cultures without writing are more limited or primitive than ours. But I think some of the improvisatory qualities, some of the multiplicity can be shut down by standardized language, by teaching correctness, by attacking and stigmatizing different ways that people speak, different accents, different expressions. And in the US environment, the kind of multilingual base of what makes American English great, which is other languages percolating through. So correctness. So I think it doesn't have to be the problem you raised, but it often is, and that poetry can push back and resist that.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I thank you again so much for your response and your question and your thoughts.
Pranab Chakraborty. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think Charles already familiar with the name as the editor of the Interaction magazine, who published my translation from your categorical imagination. He's a poet and essayist, having a special interest in supraconscious layer of life, believe in love and lunacy. So I request Pranab, please start.
Thank you, Mr. Honorable Poet Charles Bernstein and Runa Bandyopadhyay. Actually, you are a very dignified man in another sense. you not only write poems, you also a theoretician who tried to implement an idea on the surface. For this why I much honor you.
Thank you.
My question is that, do you think our future poetry will not make up conventional words by which we always try to excavate the meanings? Only the sounds will talk in future poetry by different means. That's my question. Since you are advanced in the layer of thinking as a poet. Our second question is very controversial. Philosophy, you have already used the word to interact with Kaushik Chakraborty, that philosophical words or philosophical, some term you have used in this talking period. So philosophy, do you think that philosophy is an essential part of creation, poem or anything else? It's my question. Since you are not the poet, you are the teacher also. Just like the idiot student I am asking you. Thank you, sir.
Well, if I was really a teacher, I would just say, as I did before, to both of your questions, I would answer yes or possibly no, and leave it at that, because that would be or yes and no, that would be the best pedagogic answer. But because I'm a poet and a talker, I can go on at length. I mean, these are, you're asking me a very philosophical question. So as to the sounds, I mean, what I am interested in is not that sounds become detached from meaning or from semantics, which, you know, is a possibility, but I don't believe that. I don't think that's possible. I think as long as we're in the human world or human worlds, verbal sounds always accumulate and gesture meaning, have a gestural relationship to meaning. And so you never really move away from the history, the body, the semantic meaning. I think that you can activate the transformative possibility, because language is always changing. Language doesn't mean, and words don't mean the same thing over time. And in different contexts, they shift meaning. So you can open up that multiplicity, that potentiality, but you don't eliminate its, you don't freedom is not to be free from meaning, but to make meaning free.
Oh.
And as to the future, I think we best attend to the present. I don't see any sign of the future being better, or that the past was better. So here I am now, 70. I could speak as an older person because I spoke of my aspirations when I was 18 in 1968. There are many things that are better. And I always want to say that there are many things that are improved. The situation for some people in the U.S. anyway, just to talk about the U.S. again, is definitely better in some ways for some people. But in poetry, no, I don't see improvement. I think that what I'm talking about will be an active moment of struggle and of joy and of dance, and that's what makes poetry is. Poetry's structure in the culture that I live in, not always been, may not always be, is to some degree resistant, celebratory resistance. And so it entails a kind of shutting down and closing down. And I don't see any sign that what I'm pushing back against isn't just as strong now as it was when I was young. It's different. It changes. The monster changes shape. It looks like your friend and it's not. And maybe also harder for me to sometimes realize maybe some things that are your friends look like monsters, and you have to not stay fixed in those identifications. The relation of philosophy to creation, I thought you were going to ask the relation of philosophy to poetry, which is an old and important question, which I've written about. Is philosophy, well, I can't answer that really, but it would depend on what philosophy. I mean, I think if we, for me, philosophy that is significant, let's talk about within the Western tradition, different, although, I mean, there is a really important connection to in Indian and Greek thought in that period of the axial period, 400 BCE. So like 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago, you have a kind of a movement between the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, and perhaps the Vedic and Upanishadic thought. I'm really, even from a kid, I was very interested in that. And I'm not a scholar, so I won't speak further to it. But I do think that moment of creating a kind of philosophy. I mean, if the Upanishads is philosophy or cosmology, then the answer is yes. But also the pre-Socratic philosophers as well, and the early Greek epics, and certainly the Hebrew Bible as well. Those earlier writings were cosmologies, and they were also philosophies. Lucretius is a favorite of mine later on, of course, first century BCE. Those are human beings looking at the cosmos and reflecting on it. And so the way, and they create terms that I don't get outside of, and we don't get outside of. I don't dismiss those terms because they define what I mean by earth or sky or God or godlessness. You can work through them and you don't have to remain fixed in them. But I am, as I said years ago, writing about Wittgenstein, we're limited not by language, but to language. And it's through language that we can change what some of those cosmological assumptions are. But we don't leave the history of cosmology or philosophy. We change it.
Now I request Rudra Kinshuk. Rudra,
do you hear
Kinshuk,
me?
please. Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
He is a poet, translator, and critic, recipient of the Junior Fellowship of MHRD, and written his doctoral dissertation on representation of the subaltern in contemporary Bengali novels. Rudra, please, you start here.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. It is very exciting to have this opportunity of interacting with Charles Bernstein. Let me brief my encounter and engagement with Charles Bernstein. In 2003, I was looking for ways to overstepping traditional Bengali poetry, the mainstream Bengali poetry. Then I came in contact with Charles Bernstein's poetry and his poetry workshops. And in 2004, I wrote 2 long articles in Bangla, in Bengali. One is Uttaradunik Postmodern Workshop, Uttaradunik Kobitar Karmoshala, and Charles Bernstein Otar Kobitar Karmoshala, Charles Bernstein and his poetry workshop. 2 articles I wrote in 2004, and those have been included in a book a book of essays. So in response to Umapada's question, why language has been written in such a way, I have a reply to it. Okay. The language has been written in such a way that some sort of space has been incorporated to signify that language is nothing monolithic. It is something porous. That is, some sort of uncertainty, some sort of new explanation, new emergence of new meaning are there in language. So this has been written in such a way. I have explained this in my article. And in my article, I have also referred to the concept of spota. Spota, a concept popularized by Bhartrihari. Bhartrihari explains that meaning emerges out of the sound of the word. That possibility is there in the language poetry. Okay, so we can study the concept of language poetry in light of the theory of spota explained by Bhartrihari in his theory. Now my question to Charles, an idea of plural aesthetics is there in the periphery of language poetry. It encourages amalgamation of different genres in a text. So my question is, the use of digital tools can extend its scope. Is it possible to use digital tools to extend the scope of language poetry? So this is my question, first question. And my second question is—
Let me stop there for a second, let me answer that. First of all, and to say I very much appreciated your comments and your on language, and I agree with what you say, and I appreciated the way in which you say it and the thinking, the porousness of language. I think is a very good way to put that, the way I think as well. So we share that perspective. On the digital, the answer is yes. The digital can be used for, like all technology, there are many positive things about it. There are also very many negative things about it. I'm not so much interested in the digital in terms of putting forward any one kind of poetry or any individual poet, but the general issue for the digital and the exchange of poetry, yes, we can do this, which is extraordinary. Here I am, at 11:20 in the morning in Brooklyn, talking to you at night in India. We can have this exchange. It's not really, we can exchange, as the person before said, they read my work on the internet. The potential for exchange is very, very great. The danger is, for one thing, the dominance of English. As much as it benefits those of us who write in English, in terms of the number of readers we can have, it's detrimental to any kind of world poetry culture, where languages are being shut down, muted. So the very same possibilities in technology of exchange across cultures, translation engines, possibility of the meeting and encounter, which can be transformative, also has very many negative possibilities, especially as the internet is controlled by mega corporations who are going to give preference to large mass culture organizations and corporations. It's important to keep websites local, controlled, even the design of them, not to use prefabricated sites. And we have to use them sometimes to transmit stuff, but to keep as much as possible the local control, but to allow for maximum exchange so that the internet doesn't just become a huge shopping mall controlled by mass culture as an export item from all the different cultures can export, some more than others. But the potential for exchange is great. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. And may I put the second question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So in the case of Bengali poetry, we find that new poetry does not remain limited to Kolkata, the power center of literary activities. Rather, Bangla new poetry is a result of collective effort, collective contribution from the margin, from the periphery.
Yes.
So what about language poetry in America? Is it a contribution from the margin, but it emerges out of the center itself?
It's again a question that I often think about. As I've been saying all along, words that we use, including center and periphery, certainly very important in left thought, can be confusing and people interpret them in different ways. And so from a poetics point of view, it's important to keep in mind that what might seem like the margin is in fact the center. And even if it has no power. So of course, to some degree, poetry as a field of activity is a marginal field. It's unpopular. It doesn't make money. There's not a lot of marketing and sales. It's a relatively non-profit or profit-losing enterprise in the US. So anybody engaged in poetry is engaging in a less commercial activity than other art forms or being in business or professions and so on. So that would make it a margin, economic margin. People would say, well, yes, the poetry that I'm interested in comes from the cultural centers like New York or San Francisco. And that is true. But the internet, once again, makes the participation possible for more people, and also people from all over the country come to those centers to find like-minded people. So I would say that those centers can't really be understood as dominant, because they're collectivities of people on the margins or on the periphery who have banded together, which is extremely important to organize and collectivize and see common interests. I've always written about and thought about the subaltern in Gramsci's view, something that's not only other but lesser, and including within language. Nonetheless, I'm associated with a kind of history of art and culture, which could be thought of as high culture and therefore dominant, not the people's culture. I'm aware of that dialectic, but I'm not bowed by it, because I also understand that, and this conversation with you all is an example, that even though within the United States, I don't really have access to, and am not engaged with the dominant institutions of cultural, the dominant institutions of the culture, including literary culture, which are hostile to what I do. Still, you could say that what I do, because of the intrinsic nature of it, is at the center. That in some ways, it's the degrading of the culture, the moving toward mediocrity and mass culture that exists, that is marginalizing that which is dominant. So this is, again, another kind of paradox that interests me. that the very kind of reaching for the mediocre within the mass media and the dominant cultural institutions marginalizes them from the culture in the world and even from our own culture. And that sometimes it's people working on the periphery that are most in touch with something else. But perhaps this is just what Eugene O'Neill would call a pipe dream that makes those of us on the outside feel we're really the insiders. But it's a complicated dance. And I certainly am not an oppressed person. I'm certainly not somebody who is pushed to the margins economically, socially, or culturally. Quite on the opposite, compared to many of the poets I know, and certainly most of the people in most people. So I'm aware also of the luxury of my circumstance, and I feel fortunate for that.
Thank you, Rudra.
Thank you, everybody.
I will now ask our last audience. We'll listen to Abhishek Roy. Could you hear me?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Okay. The youngest poet among the audiences, his poetical aesthetic can perhaps best described by the title of his second book, Drala, the Tibetan word, that roughly translated as energy beyond aggression. So now I will ask Abhishek to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Charles.
Hello.
Hello. It's an honor to talk to you. And I'm grateful to Swapan Rai, and also Runa Di, and Ekhon Bangla Kobitar Kagoj to provide me with this opportunity. I have not jotted down my question, but I have that in my mind. Now I will try to put it in the words. I was taken aback by your pronunciation of Rimbaud, though I was quite acquainted with this poet, a great French poet, but the line that you pronounced, I is another, that was quite something. And I was searching in the Google for some more information on that. And I was also very much touched by one of your poems. It goes as if the trees by their very roots had hold of us. Mm-hmm. So in that poem and many other language poems of yours, I had encountered multiplicity of meaning, as language poetry is characterized by the multiplicity of meaning, the subjectivity of the poem, and also by the active role that the reader has to take place in the process of the poem. I myself, I still take myself to be one of the younger generation poets, because I'm not still in my 30s. So myself and my younger poets in Kolkata face a problem while writing poems in their daily lives, because the poems that we write are of an avant-garde nature, and they are not recognized by the mainstream public because they don't find a meaning to it, because they don't find the conventional or the bourgeois or the rock logic meaning in our writings. And we are striving.
Sounds familiar.
Thank you.
Sounds familiar to me.
Thank you. And we are striving for something other, as Rimbaud says, I is other. Or maybe Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher who worked in America, he said that you are the other. Mm-hmm. Like that. Language poetry worked with multiplicity of meanings. Hermetic poetry, it worked with the closed structure of the poem and a particular manipulation to the meaning, as far I have understood. So my exact question is, meaning remains a central theme to the poem, whether be it the bourgeois meaning or the other meaning that we are striving for. Mm-hmm. And interesting observation is, in the 20th century and the 21st century, this dissatisfaction with the meaning of a poem has coincided with a bunch of people searching for the so-called meaning of life. all around the world, there are a bunch of people who are searching for the meaning of life. They are quote unquote characterized as being spiritual. In America more so than in India, because America is the melting pot of everything. So what is the correlation between the two, Charles? The meaning of life and meaning of poetry, the search for them. I want to know for you.
I thought everybody went to India to find out the meaning of life. I think I should be asking you. I actually just saw a documentary that a friend of mine, Bob Holman, did about Allen Ginsberg going to India and in a search for the meaning of life. You know, I don't mean to be a downer, but I don't want to upset the vast public that's watching this, but this will be a little bit upsetting for some. There is no meaning of life. So I'm sorry to have to share that thought with you, but that's not a bad thing. There are meanings in life, many meanings, multiple and contradictory meanings, but no meaning. I thought that your comment about bourgeois meaning was interesting. What you said reminded me a lot about what me and my friends would talk about and say when we were your age. It comes out of a very, it's strange because it can't be the same, because the situations are so entirely different, not entirely different, very different. And yet, if I put myself back 40 years, I would have said, or my friends would have said almost exactly what you are saying. So including the relation of the spiritual journey to the poetic journey. So I don't know what that means, but there are certain kinds of intersections that occur. One doesn't want to say that they're the same, recognizing how different they are, but still there is that point of contact. You know, bourgeois meanings and conventional meanings are fine. Language works through conventions, and class values are determine meaning, including middle class values. But one thing one wants to say, since you're raised in class, which I've talked about a little bit, is that there are many classes, and classes involve conflict. So the meanings are different. You know, what you mean by a fair wage sure ain't what I mean by a fair wage. I mean, the minimum wage isn't the fair wage, and so on. So it's conflict. That conflict occurs. Conflict, meaning is a site of conflict, not something that's agreed upon for all that describes a reality. It's contested. And there is certainly a relationship between searches for existential searches for value in poetry and in spiritual quests. I tend to be very wary or satiric about the language of spiritual quest in the US, in the United States. I'm not even talking about Canada or Mexico, in the United States, because they're often turned into a kind of, they're commodified. They're turned into a kind of package, or they're turned into orthodox and authoritarian religion. All religion is not authoritarian. All quests for spiritual meaning are not capitalized. Those are as legitimate things as poetry and very closely connected to them. So, you know, because we're coming to the end, one of the things that really was thrilling for me was to read Runa's couple of long articles on my work, one of which is in Boundary 2, and the other, the Jewish Dharma one, which is very, very surprising. And I think that she really, Runa, excuse me, I keep saying that, but go back to my old pronunciation, Runa, I think that she really answers that question. I agree with what she writes in her. They're not things that I would write, which is what I like about them, because she's come from a different place. But I think that she sees quite clearly how my work relates to your question. And I agree with what she writes in those two articles. as well as in a way the one on the horoscope, which takes on the more satiric aspect of what I'm talking about, but isn't entirely satiric, of course. Coincidence is enormously important. What you think is going to happen, the terms in which you imagine and talk about the future do affect what that future is in the present. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you
now
so
we can finish our session. Thank you so much, Charles, for joining us.
What enormous pleasure this is.
And
Just
also our audiences.
I couldn't be happier, and so pleased to join you. And my real deep regret is that we couldn't do this in person. We probably couldn't, even if it wasn't for COVID. But in this time of COVID, it's nice to be together as best we can. But I do hope, and I'm committed to coming to where you are and to meeting with you in person and sitting in a cafe or a bar and talking about these things, not online. So look out for me. You're going to see me.